I'm Norm Poltenson, the publisher of the Business Journal. I'd like to share with you an editorial that I wrote entitled America, a Nation of Takers. The idea was sparked from an article I read last year in the Wall Street Journal, and it was penned by Stephen Moore. He focused on something called America, a Nation of Takers, not Makers. His point was that America had morphed from a manufacturing company into a government company. He was talking about employment, and he indicated that today America has twice as many government employees as it has employees in manufacturing. As a sidelight, New York State has 3 times as many government employees as those employed in manufacturing. In 1960, it was the reverse. Now, what sparked that recollection was a recent report issued by the Heritage Foundation entitled Index of Dependence on Government. Some statistics just jumped out of that report. There are now 67.3 million Americans dependent on the government. And when I say dependent, meaning they receive some kind of largesse from the government, I'm talking about food and shelter and clothing, college tuition, health care. And when you add up all of this distribution by the government, it comes to $2.5 trillion. That wasn't a typo. You heard it right. $1 trillion. That happens to be 70% of our current budget. And if you actually look at taxes collected, it's about 100% of the taxes collected. There's some other statistics that I'm sure you're aware of. One is that the latest figures from the IRS indicate that 49.5% of American households pay no federal income tax. Keep in mind those figures from 2009. I suspect the number is over 50% today. There's another number that was released by this study from the Heritage Foundation, and that indicates that what the Heritage Foundation called the dependent Americans, those who are receiving the largest, take in about $32,748 annually in benefits. The average American worker takes in $300 less. I think you can draw your own conclusions that it may be fair to say that it pays not to work. Let me take you back 3,300 years to the basis for our concern for others in our society. And that goes back to what we read in Exodus and Deuteronomy. There are parallel statements about helping an individual whose donkey is overburdened. It's your obligation. It's very clear that we have an obligation to our fellow man. In fact, in one case it says you have an obligation to your enemy to do that. So that's the basis for our helping our fellow citizens. What seems to be missing is the very next sentence that says the individual who owns the donkey has a responsibility as well to participate, to make things better. And I think this is what we're missing, is the concept of reciprocity. That's an idea put forth by Jonathan Sacks, who's the chief rabbi of England. Martin Seligman, who's a psychologist, calls this kind of behavior learned helplessness. I think the people in addiction therapy call it codependency, which means that you and I, as employers or workers who are paying federal taxes and paying into the system, while we may feel good about helping our neighbors, in fact, are making the situation for society worse. There's one more study I want to share with you that was just released by the Kauffman Foundation, which is America's best-known think tank for entrepreneurship. The study focused on why employers are not hiring. And we got the usual answers. There's global instability, regulatory uncertainty. We have a sluggish economy. It's not growing very much. It's difficult to access capital these days. But there's one piece of information that came out from employers that really made me stop. And that is that employers say there's a huge swath of Americans who are not employable. You think they're just the youth today, but that's not the case. There are a lot of middle-aged men and women who are unemployable. They're ill-educated, they're not trained to work, and they lack a work ethic. That's what the study found. George Bernard Shaw tells us that liberty means responsibility. That's why man shuns it. Without personal responsibility, we become a nation of takers. Thank you for listening.